Welcome to Taking Up Space, the podcast with conversations exploring what it means to inhabit our bodies fully without shame or apology and reconnect with our innate wisdom to find healing and body liberation. I'm your host, Cassie Krajewski, a licensed clinical social worker, certified sex therapist, and certified body trust practitioner. For over 10 years, I've worked with women and marginalized folks to reclaim their bodies, their inner knowing, and their lives in a world that often seeks to diminish their voices and experiences. In this podcast, we'll unpack the societal norms and expectations that interrupt our embodiment, like trauma, oppression, illness and pain, and the social constructs of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight. My hope is that through this podcast, we'll learn to drop into our bodies and give ourselves permission to occupy space, physically, emotionally, relationally, and intellectually, with more confidence and authenticity. Join us as we challenge societal norms, explore what it means to find wholeness and reclaim our right to take up space as an act of resistance and body liberation. While this podcast might feel therapeutic, it is not psychotherapy and doesn't constitute a therapist-client relationship. This is a good time to mention, too, that this podcast will at times use adult language, so listener discretion is advised. If you are interested in diving in deeper, make sure you check out my online shop where I'm currently offering my Taking Up Space workbook for free. This workbook includes thought-provoking exercises, reflective journal prompts, and actionable strategies that can help guide you towards a deeper understanding of yourself and your needs and cultivate a more profound sense of embodiment and your own liberation. You can find this workbook and other resources at my website. That's inneratlastherapy.com/shop. Hey, welcome back to Taking Up Space. I'm excited to share that we have the amazing Dr. Rachel Millner on the show today. Rachel is a psychologist, certified eating disorder specialist and supervisor, and a certified body trust provider. Rachel has dedicated herself to supporting all of those grappling with forms of eating disorders and disordered eating, as well as those seeking liberation from the constraints of diet culture. Rachel perceives her role as both a therapist and an activist, guiding her clients through healing within the therapeutic space while advocating for broader societal change, deconstruct diet culture, and combat fat phobia. My conversation with Rachel covers a lot of territory, but we're going to spend a lot of our time reflecting on movement and our relationships with movement, or as it's commonly known, exercise, fitness, or physical activity. Rachel and I are also going to explore how the trauma field is perpetuating weight stigma and how we have a need to shift our narrative about how we're thinking about body size, fatness, and trauma. We're also going to talk a little bit about other forms of weight stigma in the medical system, specifically with the American Academy of Pediatrics and the weight loss injectable medications, or GLP-1s. Lots is contained in this episode. Rachel is on a journey to reclaim movement for herself and usher in more body size diversity in fitness spaces and fitness instructors as well. Specifically, she's going to share with us today how she is in a campaign to become Peloton's first fat instructor, which is amazing. Rachel sheds light on the profound impact of systemic fat phobia in fitness and wellness spaces, and she articulates how mainstream fitness fails to consider diverse body types. We talk about what it means to reclaim movement and how not everyone is ready to incorporate that back into their life. And this was certainly true for me. I had to take a long break from movement in my own recovery because it was too complicated and activating for me. And taking that break, taking that pause was immensely important and healing to de-link all of the yuck, oppressive diet culture, wellness culture shit in order to really find a more joyful, connected relationship with movement. Rachel guides us through the process of what it could look like to tune into ourselves and embrace movement as a form of body liberation. And she offers invaluable insights and also practical strategies for us on our journeys to reclaiming movement and cultivating a positive relationship with our bodies overall. Before we dive in, I do want to name that talking about movement can be really tricky and activating for folks. Movement is really complex for most of us, but especially those who have had a disordered relationship with food and body, and even more for those who live in larger bodies. For most of us in this recovery space or healing space, it can be the most challenging, tricky thing. And that's because exercise or movement has been twisted and tangled up with the oppressive diet culture, and it manifests in a toxic fitness culture. It seems like most fitness spaces, gyms, yoga studios, or other wellness fitness spaces become so fixated on movement and exercise as a way to change or control the way a body looks. And traditional fitness spaces often emphasize a narrow standard of fitness too. So what that looks like to be fit is lean and muscular bodies. And so folks who do not fit into that mold of being lean or muscular can feel really out of place and unwelcome in these fitness environments. And the majority of these fitness environments, too, are deeply entrenched in fat phobia. So weight loss is seen as the ultimate achievement and goal of those spaces. And fitness instructors or personal trainers or things can really boast around how they just push people beyond their limits to help them crush those goals, whether it's weight loss goal or a body sculpting goal or whatever. And these spaces have become particularly treacherous for fat folks, those with disabilities, transgender folks, and those grappling with a history of disordered eating. And that leaves a lot of folks feeling unseen, unwelcome, and unsure around how to have safe, accessible ways to move their bodies outside of this culture. So I know when we talk about movement, we're often coming face to face with the stories around like morality and goodness that can be wrapped up in movement, or the guilt around what people do with movement or what they don't do, and then the shame and guilt that can be wrapped up in exploring our relationship to movement or our lack of access to it, either currently or over the course of our life. And I do want to emphasize too that we always have a choice around how we engage with movement on our own terms. So there's no requirement or no messaging in this episode that you should be moving your body in any particular way. And one thing I love about this conversation with Rachel is that we talk about envisioning a different way to engage with movement while we embrace that our bodies can enjoy movement and in joyful ways, whatever way appeals to us. Um, we can also determine that there's a lot more variety and diversity around what it means to be engaging in movement, what it means to be fit, and how we can engage in this aspect of our life. And when people of different body shapes and sizes are visible in fitness spaces, it's going to foster a greater sense of belonging and inclusivity, and can invite people in to more safely determine how they want to engage with movement on their own terms with choice, regardless of size or shape. You have autonomy over your own body. You get to decide what's best for it. And that's going to be a strong thread throughout our episode today, too. So, with that introduction, we're going to dive into my conversation with Dr. Rachel Millner. I hope you enjoy it. Rachel, hey, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So, I'm a psychologist and I am in private practice in the Philadelphia area. And I've been in private practice almost 20 years now, so for a long
Mm.
time.
Mhm.
And I'm also a fat activist. And so, outside of my clinical work, I do a lot of fat activism. I give a lot of talks and have been on a number of podcasts and do a lot of writing in this area.
Yeah, you have such a great presence online, which is how I originally found you and connected and have benefited from so much of your thought leadership and your activism, and really appreciate how you put language to some different ideas and things in this space. And I'm excited to talk to you more about how your fat activism is manifesting at this season in your life too. I know we'll get there. But before we do, could you share a bit about how your body story impacts the work that you do?
Sure. And I think in a lot of ways, it's the center of the work that I do. At least it's what brought me into the work and then continues to inform the work.
Mm,
Like many people, I was raised in a home where there was a lot of weight stigma, a lot of focus on my body specifically. I have siblings, but they were not as focused on. So a lot of rules around food and movement and just bodies in general.
yeah.
And so as I went through my own eating disorders and my own healing journey, that really led me into wanting to do this work with people and just seeing the impact of anti-fat bias, seeing the discrepancies in the eating disorder field and how
Mhm.
unjust it is, and the ways that eating disorders and higher weight people are applauded, and how harmful that is. So I think it's impossible to separate when we do this work. Like, our bodies are in the room, so it's impossible to separate our own body stories from the work that we do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's everything, right? And that's informs your work and it's this reciprocal process, I think. Like the work informs our body story and vice versa.
So true.
Yeah. One of the pieces that you're focused on, or at least putting out there on Instagram a lot, is your desire to become a fat Peloton instructor. Yeah. So, can you share a little bit more about that process, your journey, and kind of how you're navigating some of that? Which I love, by the way.
Thank you.
I
I'm having
love
a good time with
seeing your
it.
process. Yes, so fun.
Yeah, I, like many people, have had a really complicated relationship with movement. When I was growing up, movement was, I really like sports, so it was fun, and I really didn't think about it as movement. It was just we went out to play. It
Mhm.
was, we had fun. And then as I got older, it started to become a lot more about burning calories and the idea that, like, focusing on movement would help with weight loss, and all of those toxic messages that we get from the world around movement. And then as I spiraled into various stages of eating disorders, movement was a huge component of my eating disorder. And
Mhm.
so it became really compulsive and obsessive, and was something that I felt compelled to do, not something that felt
Right,
I had a lot of choice.
right.
And in my
Mhm.
healing, my relationship with movement has morphed and changed over time in ways that I really didn't expect that it would. And one of the ways is that in the beginning of the pandemic, when everything shut down, I bought a Peloton. And I
Uh-huh.
bought the Peloton honestly thinking I was going to hate it. I had never been somebody
Yeah.
who like biking or cycling, and all of
That's
my
my
friends.
reaction. Like, I have not stepped on a Peloton because I
Yeah.
don't think I would like it. Okay, I'm listening.
Yeah. Yeah, a few of my friends had bought one, and I
Mhm.
was like, "We're all locked in the house. We
Mhm.
can get on FaceTime and ride together." I was sort of
That's
thinking about
fun.
it that way, and so I got the Peloton expecting not to like it, but that I could at least hang out with my friends virtually,
Yeah.
and I ended up really loving it,
Oh,
which
wow.
shocked me. And over time, I continued to really love it, but get really frustrated at the lack of fat representation amongst the bike instructors. And so,
Mhm.
as I've, over the last 4 years, or yeah, 4 years, I've continue to work on my relationship with movement and do my like fat activism in the world. And it came to this natural point where it seemed like the next step. It was one of those things,
Mm.
like, it wasn't planned out. It was, here
Yeah.
we are, and this is where I can feel the
Mhm.
pull to turn towards.
That's amazing. I love to hear that you find genuine joy in the Peloton, which I knew was true, but just to hear you talk about it, I think is so important about like reclaiming movement, finding joy in the movement and having that be the centerpiece. And I know in general fitness culture, and I'm sure in Peloton culture, although I'm not super familiar, there's a lot of contrary ideas like diet culture infused ideas, toxic fitness culture ideas, ableism in that culture. Like, how are you understanding that Peloton culture and how those systems and pieces show up in that space?
It's a good question. Peloton is interesting for me. It is very clear that they have coached their instructors to not talk about calories or weight. I
Ah,
very rarely hear their instructors
okay.
mention anything specific around calories or weight.
The numbers, okay.
Yeah, there is a lot more like nuanced ways that I could hear the
Mhm,
weight
okay.
stigma creep
Mhm,
in, but they've done a good job with being aware of the more blatant
mhm,
weight stigma.
mm,
Now, the culture amongst riders, because
mhm,
they call it a leaderboard. You can see who else is riding at the time. I try to think about it as like a community board. That I think tends to be a little more toxic. A lot of the
okay.
names that people pick for their like screen name can be really rooted in diet
Mhm,
culture. There's a lot of competitiveness around it. It
mhm,
does pop up on your screen, like if people are at a certain number of rides. So let's say this is somebody's 10th ride, it will come up and show you, and you can give them what's called a high five. But one of the other things it does is it will tell you about somebody's like consecutive days riding, which I think is
oh,
really harmful and very much rooted
yeah,
in diet culture.
yeah,
So it will
mhm,
say so and so has rode X number of days in a row. And
mhm,
then the idea is that's something to be praising.
get it. So, as you are stepping into this space with your fat activism and wanting to create more visibility and representation of larger bodied folks in that space, how has that been for you? Have there been really big barriers that you've encountered, things that have been challenging, or other successes that you've found in your process so far?
I think being in a fat body and being a fat activist, I am sadly used to encountering anti fat bias. So I
Mhm.
for sure have encountered it, maybe more than I did before because I'm putting things out that are more visible,
Mhm.
but it's not anything that I'm not used to,
Mhm.
which I'm naming partially because I think it's important for people to know what the reality is of navigating the world in a fat body and especially fitness spaces in
Yeah.
a fat body.
Mhm.
I'm also really lucky because I am in fat communities. So I've had tons of support from other fat activists, other eating disorder providers, and people who have really, like yourself, have been really supportive and wanting to help and cheering my campaign on. We'll see what happens
Yeah,
with
any updates
Peloton.
that you
I
have?
don't no updates on Peloton yet. I keep tagging and emailing and just putting it out there, so hopefully they will reach out, and I'm pretty determined, so I'm gonna keep
No.
going with it.
Yes, thank you. We are all cheering you on.
Thanks.
I really appreciate your sharing of your lived experience of how exercise and movement has changed over the course of your life and how arriving to Peloton was really a different way to engage with movement at that point. How do you help your own clients or other folks that you connect with or coach and trying to determine what joyful movement could look like for them or how they might consider reclaiming that for themselves? Because I think that can be a really loaded aspect of people's journey in whether recovery or body liberation work or fat liberation work.
I totally agree. I think for a lot of people, the movement piece is actually more complicated than the food piece. If
Mhm.
people are doing healing work
Yeah,
around those
same.
different areas, I think
Mhm.
movement is complicated for many reasons. I do a lot of work with people, partially around reclaiming choice, because our culture
Mhm.
has put such a moral value around movement. And people have internalized the idea that they are supposed to be doing some kind of movement, and that if they're not, that's a moral failing. And I
Mhm.
want people to have a choice. A lot of people
Mhm.
live in bodies that want to move. A lot of people live in bodies that don't or can't. And so I think starting from a place of neutralizing movement is a really
Mhm.
important beginning step.
Mhm.
And I have found that most of my clients, if movement has been part of their eating disorder, that they need to take a break, like
Yeah, like
full
permission
break.
to pause.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I know for me, that part of my healing was a long time that I needed to take a break from
Mhm.
movement. And I find that with a lot of my clients as well. And that if they rush into it, that it ends up pretty quickly turning
Mhm.
into being part of dieting or an eating disorder
Yeah.
again. And so, really like validating and normalizing the need for an extended break from movement.
Mhm.
And then we think about if they're going to re-engage in movement, what space do they want that to take up in their life? How do
Mhm.
they want it to feel? Is there a particular kind of movement that
Mhm.
they're interested in? For a lot of people, I think that it's important to not return to the exact same kind of movement they were
Mhm.
doing when they were dieting or in their
Yeah.
eating disorder, because that
Yeah.
can be really activating.
Mhm. Yeah, so choosing something maybe outside of their previous history or repertoire to experiment and use some creativity of what might feel different or better, and using that as good information to inform whatever choice they might wanna make next.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Are there certain aspects to your process with folks of really being able to tune inward and determine, do I like this? And does this feel good? Or is this environment supportive to me? I think sometimes I'll speak for my own folks that I've worked with, and even for myself, like being able to discern, even if it is a different type of movement or you've taken a pause, that can still be tricky. Are there certain things that you encourage people, like green flags? Ooh, keep following. That seems important, or that seems aligned for you.
I love all the language that you just used because it was so much about tuning in and not about joyful. Because I think we bump into this idea of joyful movement, and movement does not always feel joyful. And
Good
there are
point.
still reasons to do movement that are not rooted in diet culture, but aren't necessarily joyful.
Oh,
I
thank you
may,
so much for naming that. That's
yeah.
actually helped me personally, hearing you
Oh,
say that.
good. Yeah,
Mm.
I'm glad. I wish
Yeah, say
we
more though. That makes sense to me, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
Yeah, like for me, let's say on a particular day, I'm deciding to ride my Peloton. It does not mean that every time I go to ride my Peloton, I am like, yes, I am so excited and joyful.
Mhm.
It does mean that over time, I have connected to the feeling that I have after I'm done riding, that feeling of being tired. That's a good feeling, not the kind of tired that doesn't feel good,
Yeah.
or I have more energy, or I know I have 2 dogs, so I have to walk my dogs, and that using the Peloton has helped being able to take my dogs for a walk, and that feels really good.
Mhm.
And so there's reasons that I choose to move on a certain day that are not always joyful. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's
Mhm.
very joyful and
Yeah.
fun, but it's not always, and especially when you're getting back into movement. If when you've taken a
Mhm.
long break from movement, those beginning period of time coming back
Yeah.
is not joyful. It
Mhm.
can be uncomfortable. And I think it is the tuning in. It's figuring out where's the place of this is maybe hard, but pushing is okay. And where's the place
Mhm.
that we need to pull back?
Mhm.
And trying to discern. It's a lot of experimenting. It's a
Yeah.
lot of, oh, I know that day I went too far. I should have stopped sooner.
Mm.
Or I stopped and maybe I could have done a little more. And so next time maybe I will, or maybe I won't. But really trying to figure out what is your body needing or communicating so that it's coming more from an internal decision making versus
Mhm.
external, like I rode for a certain period of time because that's how long the class was.
Yeah, coming from a more embodied way of knowing and discerning that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and the connection that I'm making too is some of the problems that I've encountered for myself and also with some of the folks I've worked with around like positive body image or like joyful movement, which kind of sets up this standard where it's, oh, if I don't feel positive about my body all the time, or if I don't feel 100% joyful all the time in this movement I'm doing, that I'm doing something wrong or that it's somehow like a deficiency in me. And I like that there's a lot more neutrality and spaciousness and also some space for discomfort and not having to like all the time. Mhm.
Yes, it's so hard when toxic fitness culture is like so rooted in discomfort, like this whole no pain, no gain
Yeah, willpower,
mentality.
discipline. Yeah.
Yeah, that has taught us that pain and discomfort is good and is somehow supposed to motivate us when that is such a harmful and problematic viewpoint. But that's what most of us have internalized. So,
Mhm.
shifting to be able to differentiate between areas where you may experience some discomfort
Mm,
and you want to gently push yourself, and areas where this discomfort is a sign of I need to stop, which as therapists, it's a very similar process in therapy when people are doing really hard trauma work. Like, where's the place we push and where's the place we need to pull
mm.
back?
Yeah, yeah, and that can even change day to day, which I think,
Yes.
yeah, is why that dropping in and listening inside is so critical.
Mhm.
Since you just brought up trauma, that was actually another place I wanted to go in our conversation. So I do a lot of trauma work with folks through various modalities, EMDR, IFS, just narrative therapy, all the things. But something that you have written some about is how the trauma field really fails larger bodied folks. And I was curious if you could share a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So that blog that I wrote and some of the other things I have put out around that topic came from I was asked to be on a podcast that was specifically a trauma therapy podcast.
Mm,
Usually, if I'm on podcasts, it's within the eating disorder world or
yeah,
like fat activism world.
yeah.
And this was specifically a trauma therapy podcast. And it's the first time I've ever been interviewed for a podcast where afterwards I asked the person not to air it, and the reason was because the
Mm,
host was so fat phobic and
mm,
so focused on arguing with me
mm,
around like fatness that by the end I was like, you can't put this out there because this is basically just displaying your weight stigma, which is going to harm the people listening to your podcast. And so that was where the initial
mm.
blog came from and thinking about this. And what a lot of people know about the ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences
Yep.
scale, and I think that a lot of people are familiar with it. What a lot of people don't know is that where that scale initially came into being was within a diet company, a weight loss medical center, where the person who was running it put together that he said people are regaining weight. And of course, we don't say people are regaining weight. Maybe this diet is failing. And
Uh-huh. Yeah, what's wrong with the individual, right?
so
Mhm.
that was, and what he said was that he noticed that people who had lost the most weight were regaining the weight quickest, which of course that's what was happening.
Yeah.
But he thought, I've got to figure it out. And so he started asking questions and he came up with a couple of the people that he asked questions to. He found out that they had a history of sexual abuse. And so he started to associate fatness and sexual abuse as if being fat is a sign that you've been sexually abused and framing it as fatness being sort of a protection, that getting
Yeah.
fat is a way to keep people away. So the trauma field has been partially rooted in that anti fat bias from really early on. And when I was writing that blog and then preparing for a talk, I started looking at all different theories, like different approaches to therapy.
Mhm.
And all of them, pretty much, if you went back even further, had some history that was rooted in a fat
Mhm.
phobic narrative around
Mhm.
bodies.
Mhm.
I'll
Yeah,
pause
like
for a second because I just said a whole lot.
yeah, no, I'm tracking, and I think I really appreciate how you give a little bit more history around the ACE study because I think it's just accepted as like truth, wisdom, fact, and not recognizing how the anti-fatness is just baked in, and then how that carries forward and shapes all the intervention that we now have, or conceptualization of trauma and fatness in that space, which is hugely problematic. And that's just perpetuating the trauma of weight stigma and anti-fatness that
Right.
people,
And I
yeah.
think that is the like really important thing to name, which is that anti-fat bias is a trauma. Right? Fatness itself is not traumatic. If
Yes.
we didn't live in a fat phobic culture,
Mhm.
being fat would not be traumatic. It's the encountering of anti-fat bias that's traumatic.
Mhm.
And there are fat people who have been sexually abused, and there are thin people who have been sexually abused. Like body size does not tell us anything about a person's trauma history beyond
Mhm.
knowing that if somebody lives in a fat body, they've encountered anti fat bias.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I was just in a training a couple of weeks ago as a therapist, and it was a trauma-based training, and we had to do a role play, and someone chose to role play as my client, someone who had experienced some kind of trauma in the past and now had this relationship with food and their body, and they were fat and all of these things, and it was just so palpable, and it was interesting to be in that therapist chair as a role play, like, trying to work with like, on so many layers, right, of, "Oh, can we bring a little bit of curiosity to that assumption?" Right? And I really find some resistance in that, in specifically in this training that I went into, but also in the trauma therapy field as a whole. I sense this real resistance to considering that is not a pathology, right?
It's so frustrating that
Mhm,
there's still so much anti-fat bias in the trauma field,
mhm,
and that unless somebody's really explicitly trained in working with folks with trauma and understands health at every size and body trust and fat activism, that they are then likely, if they're not trained in both, to have a really fat phobic view of trauma and body size.
mhm. Have you encountered, Rachel, with anyone that you've worked with that they've really been bought in to that same narrative? That's how they understood their own experience and that shifted over the course of their working with you, or maybe even the opposite, that maybe they maintained that narrative. I'm just curious about your experiences there.
For sure. I think a lot of people who come in and are in larger bodies come in from a place of wanting to understand why they're in a larger body and
Mm,
then wanting to figure out how to change it.
uh-huh.
And that makes sense. That's where people come from. Even people at this point, when they reach out to me, know that, I'm trained as a body trust provider, that I don't help with weight loss, that I'm a fat activist. And still, people come in and what they want is to figure out why they're in a higher weight body and how to not be.
Mm,
And so some of that work is moving to a place of size diversity, like fat
mm,
bodies have always existed, they will always exist. It's not a pathology to be in a fat body.
right.
And then better understanding that person's body story and that person's relationship with food. And the need for nuance is so important because I don't ever want to erase somebody's lived experience and ways that somebody has coped. And there are people who have coped with trauma by turning to food
Mhm.
or soothing themselves in that way, which is such an effective and smart way to cope.
Mhm.
And if their body story is, I went through a trauma, food became a very wise coping mechanism.
Mhm.
And for me and my body, that led to weight gain. That is their body story. And my job is not to discount that or erase it. What I do want to help with is moving away from the idea that is everybody's body story who
Yeah.
is in a fat body.
Yeah. Something that's coming up for me right now is, as you say, fatness is not pathology. The same would be true, let's say I do EMDR with someone on their trauma. If I do EMDR with someone on their trauma, that doesn't necessarily mean that their body is going to change or get smaller or anything like that. Like their body may stay the same or it may change, right? There's no guarantees in that, but it's not linked with this trauma healing necessarily. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what is guaranteed is that somebody's either going to lose weight, gain weight, or their weight's going to stay the same. One of
Yeah,
those
like
is going to happen. I can
it's all on the
guarantee that,
table, right? Yeah.
but I don't know which one. And different ones may happen at different times, depending on their body and how their body heals.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you're focused on right now in your own work, Rachel, whether it's your clinical work or your activism, that's really compelling to you right now, something you're really thinking through or working on?
I think what is on my mind a lot, in addition to my Peloton campaign, is probably two things. One is thinking about the impact that anti fat bias and the recent American Academy of Pediatric standards for working with higher weight kids
Yeah.
are going to impact this generation of kids.
Mm.
So that's on my mind a lot. And very linked to that is about the promotion of these injectable medications that were are very effective in treating people for people's diabetes and now are being prescribed at much higher doses with the intent of them being for weight loss.
Mhm. Yeah. Which one do you want to start with there to unpack a little bit? They're just week-long series, on that is
Exactly.
what we could do, but yeah, maybe we can start with the American Academy of Pediatrics just for a moment and help. Maybe we can back up and just identify, because some people listening may not know what the American Academy of Pediatrics has put out within the past year or two. I forget how long it's been now, but
Yeah.
yeah, what's happening there?
Yeah. So the very sort of general overview, and I do not recommend going to read this document. It's a pretty awful document. But the American Academy of Pediatrics put out this document talking about potential quote unquote interventions for working with higher weight kids. So they go through a lot of what you would expect, talking about what they call behavioral weight management, focused on individual or familiar behavioral changes. They talk about and then they move on as they get through each sort of progressive step. And then they get to talking about using medications to try to promote weight loss in children and adolescents. And then they also talk about bariatric surgery in kids and adolescents. They actually talk about identifying higher weight kids as young as 2 years old. And that's like the point at which they talk about intervening around
Mhm.
body size, which is just, I don't know if cursing is allowed here, but horrifically fucked up. Yeah.
Yes, I just feel this immediate clench in my entire body. It's just so much grief and sadness and anger,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
Ah, and the medications piece too is one thing, but then the to consider surgically altering a kiddo's body when they're in so much place of development and growth where they just need to trust that they get what they need. Mm.
I know. When we're talking bariatric surgery, we are talking about removing part of a normally functioning organ.
Yeah,
And
healthy in any other ways.
and I think people don't always understand that
Mm.
because that's not what the bariatric world talks about. They don't promote what
Yeah.
they're actually doing.
Mhm.
And so framing it for people is, I think, really important because if we talked about removing or oh, changing any other like healthy organ, like the liver or any other,
Yes.
people would
Mhm.
be horrified.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just the intense anti-fatness in medical spaces and just the fear mongering of what it means. The childhood obesity epidemic that I think has run its course, but is still alive and well, is manifesting in all of this now. And then the medications too. So let's talk about GLP-1s and what are you doing some activism around this here? I know I've seen you on Instagram at least a couple of times, but what is that work looking like for you?
Yeah, what I'm finding is wanting to really hold a ton of nuance. And I'm finding within the fat activism community that a lot of my clients who do have type 2 diabetes are really feeling alienated because we're not
Mhm.
holding enough nuance in these
Yeah.
conversations. And
Mhm.
the impact when we talk about these medications in a generalized negative way, I think leads to people who are taking these medications feeling a lot of shame.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to hold as much nuance as I can online, which is really hard because online doesn't have a lot of space for nuance, but
Yeah.
also in my conversations with people
Mhm.
and really differentiate between the use of these medications for diabetes management and
Yeah.
then what the pharmaceutical industry has done, which is very irresponsible, is without really much research at all, has more than doubled the dosage of these medications and decided that they're going to use that as getting approval to use those as weight loss medications. And so I'm just wanting to differentiate, talk about very
Yeah.
different reasons that
Yeah.
somebody might take
Mhm.
these medications and that the pharmaceutical companies, the weight loss companies are really co-opting the language of fat activism, and they're talking about wanting to end weight stigma. And so I'm wanting to call them out on that and
Yeah.
name if you see somebody saying that they want to end weight stigma and then they are selling something to promote weight loss, you know that what they're actually invested in is not ending weight stigma.
Yeah, because it's still placing the problem with the individual and that the fatness is bad or a pathology, right? Versus placing it outside in the culture or the systems that hold that up.
Yeah, we don't end stigma by stigmatizing people.
And regardless of whether someone is on that medication or not, even if they are, it doesn't mean that it's going to change. They may still be in a fat body, right? And so fat bodies will always exist regardless. And so weight stigma is really where we need to, actual weight stigma is where the focus should be.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting as you mentioned the research, the limited research around GLP-1s that so many folks are now joining on and saying this is the new thing that's going to solve this obesity epidemic or whatever, I'm using air quotes for people listening. Just the devaluation of fat bodies, that there can be such limited research, and yet that is worth putting fat bodies on the line in pursuit of that. Like better to take that risk than to exist in their bodies as they are.
Yeah, the people who are invested in profiting off of these weight loss medications or diet programs are coming from the perspective that it's better to be dead than fat. And so are willing to risk the lives of fat people because they think that the possibility of making somebody who's fat into a thin person is worth the risk.
Yeah. It's such a hard conversation, and I really appreciate you naming just the layered nature to it because there's so much here, and bodily autonomy is here too. I think it's just holding all of that space is so important in this conversation. So thanks for tackling that a little bit here with me. As we start to wrap up our conversation, I'm curious for you, Rachel. The name of this podcast is Taking Up Space. What does it mean for you to take up space in your own life right now?
I love that name, by the way, for the podcast. It's such a great name. So, a few things. Obviously, this Peloton campaign is a way that I'm taking up space. And what I have found, which actually has surprised me a little bit, is that the physical taking up space has been a lot easier than the taking up space in terms of a platform and saying, this is what I want. I think I've done
Mm,
a lot of work about having my body out there. I've been in pictures, I've posted pictures in bathing suits and whatever. So I don't have as much around my body taking up space. But this was the first time I think on social media that I like use my platform around something that I want and not as much around like educating people. And
mm,
so that has been a lot more challenging. So it's just
mm,
been interesting to notice that for me.
mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I really appreciate your vulnerability and sharing that, vocalizing your desires and your wants and longings just
yeah,
feels a little bit different way to
it's so
occupy
different.
space right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so many of us focus on, especially those of us who do this work, about letting our bodies take up space,
Mhm,
which of course is also part of the healing and important. And it really has surprised me like how much taking up
mhm,
emotional space and wanting and desire and space in those ways has felt, like you said, a lot more vulnerable.
mhm. And I'm so personally appreciative, and I think the community, I hope you're feeling the appreciation of we all benefit when we occupy space in that way. And I just am so grateful to you for all the work that you've done, but also what you're doing here and leading into this. It's really supportive and beneficial to my process. So thanks, Rachel.
I appreciate that so much. It's been so helpful when people let me know how it impacts them because I think it's easy to get caught in the like day to day and not always widen the lens. And so I always appreciate when somebody says, oh, your work impacted me in whatever way. It's nice to hear that.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for taking it in. It's authentic.
Thanks.
So, Rachel, if folks are interested in finding you, if they haven't already found you, which would shock me maybe, but if not, how can folks find you and see what you're up to with your Peloton journey or anything else?
Yeah. So in terms of social media, I spend pretty much most of my time on Instagram, which is just at Dr. Rachel Millner. All of my Instagram stuff cross post to my professional Facebook page, which is Rachel Millner PsyD, but everything's initially posted on Instagram. And then if people want to know more about my therapy practice, and I have a group practice, I have some other really amazing therapists who work with me, then that website is just rachelmillnertherapy.com.
Amazing. We'll link all of that in the show notes. Rachel, thank you again. And to everyone listening, thanks for being here. And I hope you all take up a little bit more space this week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it to be a resource for you in your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation journey. I hope you can continue the conversation with me over on social media by sharing your thoughts, offering your ideas and suggestions for future episodes, or just connecting. You can find me on Instagram at Inner Atlas Therapy. If you liked this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show in your preferred podcast platform. And share this episode with a friend. This ensures that more people can find the pod and will amplify our message of body liberation for all. If you haven't checked it out yet, I have a free Taking Up Space workbook available. This workbook will have you engage in self-reflection and embodied practices as you navigate your own journey of taking up space. You can find this free resource on my website, inneratlastherapy.com. I'll also link in the show notes some additional resources I've developed in my online shop to help you deepen into your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation work. Thanks again for being here. And until next time, I hope you join me in the resistance and find some ways to take up space this week. I'll see you next time.